back when I would do talks at, like, say, American Psychological Association, late 90s, early 2000s, I'd have to spend half the talk trying to explain what virtual reality was or these concepts. Most people, the only thing they knew of it was Lawnmower Man.
Right.
I don't have to do that any longer. It's in the public consciousness and in the clinical consciousness. The fear by clinicians has started to go down. Some clinicians were very anti-technology early on. Now they're starting to turn the corner.
Welcome to another episode of Mental Health in the Age of the Metaverse. I'm your host, Christian Ulstrup. My guest today is Professor Skip Rizzo. Skip is a clinical psychologist, the director of medical virtual reality at the University of Southern California's Institute for Creative Technologies, a USC Department of Psychiatry researcher and virtual reality pioneer who has spent over 2 decades bringing VR into clinical settings for management and treatment of conditions including PTSD, traumatic brain injury, autism, ADHD, Alzheimer's, and stroke. Skip, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
I'm really glad you could join me. So just to start, you've got over 2 decades of experience, have been very much on the frontier for a long time. I think a lot of us in the space really look up to you and all the work that you've done, bringing VR into clinical practice. How did you become interested in virtual reality in the first place?
How did I get mixed up with this crazy crew? Well, it really came out of recognizing a need in my own clinical work. I was working in a brain injury rehab center for about 10 years. And about 7 years in, I got really frustrated with limitations in the types of tools that we had. And it was in the early 90s, and computer technology was coming along a little bit. You could see the writing on the wall, but also game technology had evolved. And I started using a game called SimCity as a tool delivered on a Nintendo NES system, delivered on a tool in a group with higher functioning folks with traumatic brain injury. And it was a perfect game because it's the ultimate executive function training activity. And a lot of my clients really took to it. I had another client come in even before SimCity, came running in my office with a Game Boy when they first came out and go, "Skip, you got to see this." And I didn't know what it was. I go, "Well, show me." And I watched him for 20 minutes glued to this thing. And, this is a kid with frontal lobe injuries. I couldn't motivate on traditional training tools, methods for more than 5 or 10 minutes. And here he was glued to it. And, he was like a Tetris warlord. So those 2 incidents kind of sparked off the idea that we've got to up our game, and particularly in cognitive rehab, but in other areas as well. And I learned about virtual reality. I accidentally heard Jaron Lanier speak about it on NPR. And at that point, I talked to my boss after hearing Jaron. And I said, I think there's something to this VR thing. This is, I think, 93. And she goes, "Well, it's interesting. I just got this flyer in the mail for a conference called Virtual Reality in Persons with Disabilities. If you want to go, we can cover your trip." I said, "Sure." And so I went. Nobody was doing anything in cognitive assessment. It was all visionary early stuff. The technology was very immature. But I got excited. And next year it came around. I wrote a paper. And then at that point, the idea had been formed, and the only way I could actually implement it would be to be at a major university where I had access to the equipment, very expensive equipment at the time, and computer science experts. And so I took a postdoc at USC in 95, had a day job at USC working in the Alzheimer Center, but I just made a lot of friends with computer scientists and eventually got access to equipment. And at that point, that's where it all started. We started building cognitive assessment and rehabilitation strategies, again, with very primitive and expensive equipment at a time where people really viewed VR as a failed technology because there was so much hype in the early 90s. But the delivery was pretty lame. But I knew it was going to come around. I didn't think it would take 20 years, but I knew eventually, incrementally, the technology would evolve and that the idea was sound. And in fact, The good news is over this whole period of time is that, as you know, the technology is now caught up with the vision from way back then. And we have a pretty respectable scientific base to provide us with a rudder, at least, for where we can apply VR clinically, where it makes sense, where it can have positive impact on clients, where it can engage them in wide variety of clinical interventions. And so we're in a great spot now with the costs coming down and the general awareness and acceptance. It's not a science fiction dream anymore. It's real reality. So
Yeah.
that was a thumbnail sketch of the trajectory since the early '90s.
And you mentioned all the clinical evidence that's been generated over the past couple of decades. I've found that that's something that is surprising to a lot of folks who are, maybe VR is something new for them, just how much research has been done. Would you mind just highlighting, a few of those use
Yeah.
cases? How is VR been used in clinical settings, and what does the research tell us?
There's like 4 or 5 core areas, but then many spin-offs off of those core areas. I like to say expose, distract, motivate, measure, and engage. And so in the exposure area, of course, the granddaddy of all clinical VR apps is an area of exposure therapy for anxiety disorders like phobias and later on PTSD. A large body of work that's been quite favorable. Of course, all this has to be taken in the context that science never sleeps. There's still a lot of things that we need to study and understand at a basic science level as well as a clinical application level. But a lot of work, probably the largest body of work, is in this type of exposure therapy delivery. And when we talk about distraction techniques for pain management, for acute pain management, that's an area that really Hunter Hoffman in late '90s gave birth to in his seminal work with reducing pain in people undergoing burn wound therapy, daily wound care, physical therapy after skin grafts, all very painful procedures that he found that by putting someone in a VR headset as opposed to letting them play a regular computer game, there was dramatic reductions in pain, and that the effect was sustained over multiple trials. Since that time, the research has expanded beyond acute pain to discomfort reduction. Say, for example, people undergoing chemotherapy, make that experience a little more pleasurable and compress the perception of time. A lot of times people are in a VR experience during, a 1 hour infusion session and they think it was a half hour, 45 minutes. And now a lot of interesting work is emerging now on chronic pain, which is fundamentally different because it's not like with acute pain, you can distract somebody in a VR experience. With chronic pain, you can't wear that headset 24/7. You've got to teach people skills or do things that reshape or adjust how the brain perceives pain, and that will carry over into the real world. So those are two large areas, but equally large is in the rehab space. This is what brought me into the field to begin with, the idea of gamifying very boring, repetitive, and frustrating activities of, say, physical rehab after a stroke or a brain injury, or cognitive rehab, which, if it's not engaging, people will not do the sufficient trials to recover attention, process skills, memory, executive function, and so on. There's been a lot of good work in these areas. Of course, measurement, that's another area that goes across all areas. Everything that goes on in a VR experience can be quantified and measured in ways that go well beyond classic or traditional assessment approaches, where primarily relies on behavioral observation. There's some quantification that's more objective in these areas, of course, but VR, it's more comprehensive. And I would say, a lot of work now is evolving across different clinical populations that is found to be engaging, that it might engage people in therapeutic approaches that they would be loath to participate in otherwise. So there's these core processes that VR enables, and now it's a matter of creatively, but in a scientifically informed manner, decide where you want to apply a VR application that is theoretically informed, where there is some science to support it, or you at least have a good hypothesis you want to test, and implement it and grow it from there. But there's addiction work. There's tons of stuff evolving in that area. There's just every time I open up my laptop, I see somebody's coming up with a new idea, and I say, "Damn, I wish I thought of that one, because that's a really good one." And one thing I do want to add is that doesn't always get into the mix, and this is an area I believe you're involved in, of course, is interaction with virtual characters online, whether they're avatars driven by a real person or autonomous agents, which we've done a good bit of work with, where you can interact with a piece of software but embodied as a person. Like, for example, our work with virtual patients, where we can train doctors and clinicians, whether it's in conducting a standard review of systems in a medical interview, or we published a randomized controlled trial at the VA up at Puget Sound on training clinicians on motivational interviewing tactics. And it gives clinicians the opportunity to implement their skills, not just read about it and watch a video, but to actually have to construct how they're going to interact with patients, oftentimes difficult patients or patients with real challenges. I like to always say in that area, gives clinicians a chance to screw up a bunch with a virtual patient before they get their hands on a live one, which is a very important thing. Make your mistakes in the simulation, not with real people. I think that's a broad sweep there. We could talk just on this question for hours.
Absolutely. I think that's really interesting. This, idea of taking what you learned in the virtual world and then applying it back in reality. That's very interesting that's being done for motivational interviewing. Now, speaking of applications, there was one that of course came to mind that you're pretty famous for, which is BraveMind. So you worked with veterans, PTSD. Could you tell me a little bit about that project?
That project began in 2003 as a simple dream that we could modify an already existing Xbox game called Full Spectrum Warrior, take the content, which had a Middle Eastern theme to it, and retool it for an exposure therapy application for treating PTSD in service members coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. As it turned out, it became a very complicated process to evolve the content in a user-centered fashion based on the needs of those service members. So it was a hard sell in the beginning, but in 2004, a visionary guy at the Office of Naval Research, Russ Schilling, saw the merit in the idea and funded the work. And we were able to build out a 4-scenario world for putting people back into simulations of context in which they had a difficult time. Now, a lot of times people hear this at first blush and they say, "Why the hell would you do that? Why would you make somebody go back to that?" And the simple answer is, well, we follow the science and the idea of helping somebody to confront and reprocess difficult emotional memories, but in a safe place, like a VR simulation in a clinician's office. That leads to what we call extinction learning. The brain is less triggered by the stimuli, and it pulls out, I think there's a strong cognitive component here, because it pulls out memories and gets people talking. When you put somebody in that simulation and you can systematically modify it and control it in real time, all of a sudden it's becoming more and more relevant for that person, and they start talking about things that they haven't talked to anybody about before. A lot of times service members come back, they don't want to burden their family or their friends with their war stories and the pain and things they saw, but they will in that environment. And that's part of the healing process, is being able to put it into a story and to be able to share it with a compassionate and thoughtful clinician. It's trained in this trauma-focused approach. So that project has evolved over the years quite a bit. We've done quite a bit of research, and we've gone from 4 worlds to 14 based on user feedback, clinicians and patients telling us what they really need. And over time, it's really grown. We currently have a nonprofit foundation called Soldier Strong that has raised money to donate all the equipment needed to implement this therapy at any VA. And that's been a real boost. The various iterations of the system went out to about maybe 150 sites. But now the latest and greatest version, I think, is out at about 30 VA sites, all freely donated by this foundation. Really remarkable work by this guy, Chris Meek, who started the foundation and has been able to raise money to support veterans. So, the data looks good. We've got some unique findings. We know that from the last randomized controlled trial, if you were to ask people before they embarked on their therapy, if they had a choice between VR exposure or traditional, what's called prolonged exposure done in imagination, if they had a choice, what would they pick? 77% would have picked VR. So now we may be able to break down some of the barriers to care by getting more people into therapy, particularly digital generation folks. And also, we found some unique effects with VR being more effective for patients with comorbid depression, PTSD. And that makes a lot of sense because people that are depressed, it's hard to activate and to engage. But the VR seems to do that in an effective way. And of course, more research is needed. That's a classic academic statement at the end of everything they do. But I'm really proud about that project because it's one where it escaped the lab. And it's constantly evolved. We built out a military sexual trauma version. We've worked with groups developing police versions now. I have one project outside of USC looking at supporting healthcare and healthcare professionals that have been kind of beaten down and burnt out by the COVID experience. On top of, they were already a rugged group that were suffering. If you look at the suicide rates for docs, nurses, and other allied healthcare professionals, they're high on the occupational suicide rate level, above most other professions. So they were having a tough time, and COVID just put an exclamation point on it. So I'm happy to see that happening. And then now we have a project that's just getting off the ground, unfunded at this point, but a lot of enthusiasm by different components, different people, to address the mental health challenges that are going to arise with the Ukrainian population at various levels of intervention. But we've got now a team of Ukrainian clinical providers that are like an advisory team. We've got Eastern European companies that are helping to build some content, a group in Romania. We've got some folks here in the States that are pitching in. And, that's really I think that's an important topic to be addressing in view of what's going on
very exciting and much needed. And you mentioned, just sort of the complicated nature of getting this off the ground back in the early 2000s. Clearly, the technology has come a long way. We're now entering another sort of hype cycle with VR, or I guess the Metaverse is what we're calling it now. The sort of positive angle on that is, this project, maybe it becomes easier to get the content to folks in Ukraine, to make the scientifically validated BraveMind interventions available to more veterans. But then, of course, you've been at this for a couple of decades. How much of this is hype? How much of this do you think is really this time is different? What are your thoughts on what's going on with the Metaverse in 2022?
Well, sometimes hype gets a bad name.
Yeah.
Because one of the first barriers to care that you have to overcome is awareness that there's something out there that can make a difference. And, look at the Metaverse. That was a term coined back in 2000. Back in 92 in Snow Crash. and came up again, Ready Player One. But, we had Metaverse technology in the 90s, active worlds, Black Sun, avatar-based worlds where people could gather. Of course, Second Life, and all the many that exist today. So it's not a new concept, but the fact that Mark Zuckerberg went out and bandied it about, I think certainly there's a lot of hype, and there may have been a little bit of misdirection there when he promoted that concept, because he was under a lot of heat for some of the sins of Facebook. But just like Oculus served to drive an ecosystem that has led to the availability of low-cost and high-fidelity headsets, no matter what you think, that was a key thing that happened. And God, I remember how excited getting my first Oculus dev kit, and look at how much it's grown, how much better it's gotten in a short period of time. God, you couldn't get anything like what you can get in a standalone headset. The fidelity of that experience is something that you would have had to pay $20,000-$30,000 for, and not even be as good just 10 years ago. So there was a lot of hype around VR and Oculus and all, but look what it resulted in. So I think it's the same thing with the metaverse. He's trying to get people for whatever his motivations. I'm not going to make any inferences, but I think we can benefit from it, particularly in healthcare. I have a very narrow vision in that, I'm most concerned about how we advance and evolve clinical VR, because I think there's tremendous opportunities in this space that make a difference for people. And so if there's a little hype tossed in, there's these fancy predictions about people spending half their day in the metaverse and shopping and doing most of their social interaction. Well, I don't know if that's going to happen. I think people still like the real world, but we can talk about that later. I think the real world has some real benefits, but certainly, the metaverse concept, now that people are kind of riding it, that there's a lot of money being invested in the concept, that's a positive thing for growing this out in a fashion that wouldn't have happened it would have happened, but it might have been a lot slower. So I'm okay with a little bit of hype, as long as we can leverage what comes out of that for a good human purpose. Entertainment, fair enough, good stuff, but education and mental health, come on. These are the things we really have to put our focus on. And if we can leverage what these folks are driving with this development, then I'm all for it.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. And it's attracting a lot of talent to the space as well. You have entrepreneurs, you have engineers, designers, all becoming more interested, and also clinicians, right? So traditionally, healthcare education have been quite conservative, but now some of that hype is bringing awareness, and people are opening up to the idea of leveraging these new digital media in a way that could be beneficial for patients or for students. So I think there's a huge amount of benefit there. And
let me add something there.
Yeah.
Back when I would do talks at, like, say, American Psychological Association, late 90s, early 2000s, I'd have to spend half the talk trying to explain what virtual reality was, or these concepts. Most people, the only thing they knew of it was Lawnmower Man.
Right.
I don't have to do that any longer. It's in the public consciousness and in the clinical consciousness. The fear by clinicians has started to go down. Some clinicians were very anti-technology early on. Now they're starting to turn the corner. I'm sorry I interrupted. I just wanted to make that point there.
No, I agree. I mean, even, I've been sort of an entrepreneur in the space for a very short period of time, but even just in the last year, 18 months, there have been pretty big sea changes in terms of receptivity. So hopefully, that'll make room for innovation to flourish and be helpful. And to that point, so you're at a pretty unusual position, because you operate at the intersection of the clinical world, research, and academia, but you're also an entrepreneur. Co-founder. You work with entrepreneurs. You're an advisor, and there's a lot going on. There's a lot of discussion around. You mentioned entertainment. video games, sports. Those are things that are being talked a lot about. And we discussed some of the work that's been done. I want to switch gears and focus on the future for a second. In research and in the startup world, what are some topics, startups, research questions that you're really excited about right now in clinical virtual reality that you think deserve more attention?
Well, you know, one overarching thing is that in terms of the science, I think we've got to redo a lot of the science that was done at an earlier time when we had more limited technology, because I think some of those results, I think the technological capabilities will make things so that we get stronger effect sizes when we implement some of these things. So overarching, like I said, science never sleeps. We got to continue to look at and evolve these applications. But in terms of specific areas, of course, I'm going to just one sentence pitch. Trauma is ubiquitous, and we need now to look at everything that's been done in the past on trauma-focused approaches, whether it's treatment or assessment or prevention of the impact of trauma by doing things in a VR world before that trauma occurs. We've got to expand that across a wide range of populations, from first responders, civilians affected by terrorist events or events of war, but not being non-combatants, sexual trauma, horrific area that really needs more attention. So that's an area that I think needs to grow police officers. I think we don't recognize the stress that police are under on a daily basis. And some of the problems with policing, I think, may be due to subclinical or subthreshold PTSD, that after years of being ground down, they might not qualify for the full Monty of PTSD, but maybe they're a little bit emotionally numb, and maybe to certain specific groups that they might have to work with. And maybe they're a little hypervigilant and jumpy from everything they've seen and done. That's not a good combination of symptoms for pulling a trigger in a high impact situation or doing other things. So I think that's an area that needs to continue. There's a lot of VR, a lot of companies in police training, but I think we need to take some of that content and expand it towards providing better mental wellness for these high stress professions. On the other end of the spectrum, I think children, applications for children, some of the stuff that you're doing, it's really impressive. I think the research on children has been somewhat limited, but not that much, but somewhat, by the disclaimer on all headsets not to be used by people under 13. I think that's just a way to protect for liability. We're not talking about children wearing a headset for 2 or 3 hours a day. We're talking about being able to use immersive experience for brief periods of time where we don't see critical incidents, adverse effects really occurring, and where children can begin to benefit. And particularly, just a last bit on the trauma element, children that have had adverse childhood experiences. If you want to put your money in any area that will have a fundamental impact on society, it'll be addressing ACEs, the acronym for it, in children and teenagers. And one application that comes to mind is Jessica Stone's sand tray application, virtual sand tray. Really great application for giving children a vehicle for expressing in a VR world their story and constructing a world that the child and the clinician can navigate through and be in and hear a child's story in a way they wouldn't be able to represent verbally otherwise. But many other areas where, there's a direct correlation between the number of adverse childhood experiences that someone has and later medical problems, cardiovascular problems, even lung cancer, all these physical problems, diabetes, but all the psychological issues of depression, anxiety, and so forth, poor coping, leading to functional problems of not finishing school or substance use disorder or, a myriad of challenges that limit a person moving out into adult life. So I would say that addressing the needs of children, and I really like, your approach towards creating this program to address the needs of children in this interactive format that might be engaging. I know that we'll talk later about, parents wanting to reduce screen time and wanting to, the concerns about technology. And I think, many of those concerns you have to listen to and are valid, but the judicious use of technology to address these problems is the counterbalance to that. And that we can't cast a blind eye to it. Like, oh no, we can't use technology with kids. Well, they're growing up with it. The horse is out of the barn. There's other strategies for, getting children to do things outside of a technological world. But when it comes to clinical care, psychoeducation, we can't cast a blind eye to the power that technology has that they grew up with, they're attuned to. I think kids nowadays, even with education, I can't imagine kids that have grown up playing mind maze and doing all kinds of other digitally stimulating activities.
Yeah.
How do you engage them in a classroom environment where it might not have that dynamic element? Not that that you're going to eliminate, the blackboard writing and listening skills, but if you judiciously mix, these types of VR, Metaverse type apps, AR into the classroom, I think you can make it so the other stuff has more meaning, and you've got a visualization tool. You've got an interactive, dynamic way of teaching complex, abstract problems. Anyway, I think one last thing on this is, more work, of course, with autonomous virtual agents in addition to the avatar-based worlds is an important area. And all of this, if I give a tip to the folks in industry, you may want to brand as having a product that addresses a clinical diagnosis, but I think a transdiagnostic process-specific approach is going to be more thoughtful for the long-term legs of a company to understand what the process is that you're trying to address, and then build out your product around that. But don't lose sight of the process, whether you're trying to teach calming or relaxation or better focus or attention processes or emotional regulation. These are the processes that, when they're out of whack or tilt mode, lead to these things we call diagnostic labels. But to be careful, always keep sight of what are the processes that you're trying to address and what's the science that underlies that in the real world.
Right.
What's the basic science that informs how you use these technologies to amplify and extend a clinical process that eventually may reduce the occurrence of a diagnostic category.
So really there to make sure you're focused on the process part when you're designing your product. So some words of wisdom for entrepreneurs looking from the outside in, getting excited about the metaverse. Yeah.
I understand branding. You got to brand something. You got to appeal, but brand, but then with a subcategory label of what it is that you're actually doing. I mean, I see so many companies that say, "Oh, we've got a treatment for depression." No, you actually have a calming, relaxation, mindfulness type application. That's not a cure for depression. That's one component of a cure for depression. And it might not even be the biggest component. So I think being careful that maybe saying we develop tools that do this, this, and this, and it has value for a when it's embedded within a multi-component approach for depression, stuff like that.
And also, I mean, just as somebody who started very much on the outside, I don't have a clinical background. We now have a co-founder who who joined us about 6 months ago. We're on the lookout for a long time. I found that there are a lot of people who are very willing to help, who understand the science, who have, the clinical expertise. And so, always making sure you're consulting the experts and, you're paying attention to substance is, I think, very important in this space.
That's the beauty of this world. You get to
Yeah.
work with people transdisciplinary. You don't just work with psychologists all the time, or you don't just work with computer programmers all the time. To do these things right, you need that mix of expertise, and that's very stimulating. That's one of the most exciting things about working in this field is the diversity of people you get to work with.
I totally agree. It's very fun, and both one of the things, it's exciting because it's very complex. It's sort of a rapidly evolving, I think, set of interrelated areas of study. The flip side to that, though, is I think for a lot of parents who are seeing their kids grow up with the technology, it can be a bit frightening because it's not really clear how this is going to pan out. And you talked about, look, the kids are growing up with tech. That's kind of where they already are. It's not inherently a bad thing. And what we like to focus on is the difference between quality and quantity when it comes to screen time. They're really not all screen time is the same, certainly. And I do think there's a case to be made for reality as being sort of like your where you place your roots. So I wanted to ask you on that point as somebody who's been working with VR for such a long time. You've mentioned before that reality is pretty great. Could you make the case for reality in 2022?
Well, reality. What's the case? The case is that, well, let's just take it from the technological limitations of VR. You don't have very good touch in VR. You've got a little bit of smell. So there's companies working in that area, particularly OVR. But inherent social support and gatherings of real people in real places that are inherent, just naturally beautiful. I think you can create those experiences in VR, but I don't think it has the same impact. Now, keep in mind, there's a lot of people that don't have access to beautiful places to go. You think of inner city youth, and maybe VR is one way to give them an experience that might make them want to go to the real thing. There's an application by Penumbra called World Traveler, which is spherical video of famous cities in the world. We use this with justice-involved youth at a facility here in Los Angeles. These kids, some of them, they haven't even been 8 miles west to the beach in their lifetime, let alone thinking about going to Paris or London or whatever. You give them this experience that there's a wider world out there, and it might foster a drive to want to see that wider world, to see the reality. VR has in Metaverse apps, tons of great experiences you can't get in the real world, but the real world gives you a multi-sensory experience that you can share with real people, with a sense of touch, with a sense of preparing yourself, whether you're going out in the winter and you have to put a coat on, or you're going to the beach and you got to bring a bathing suit. I mean, there's a whole thing about reality. I mean, I can't believe we're at a point now where we have to make the case for reality. But I think that if parents want to reduce screen time, then maybe they need to take a little more time themselves and do what they can to give their children shared experiences in real reality that makes it so that maybe a child who's been in VR for a large percentage of their life may go to their parents and say, when can we go to a real beach? I've heard about these things called forests. I want to actually touch a tree. I think there's something there. And of course, the social impact, while you can have deep social connections in digitally mediated environments, it's not the same thing as being in the real world with real people and the sense of touch. I think the fact that we haven't solved the haptics challenge in VR yet might be a good thing.
Yeah.
That's something the real world still offers.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I guess I don't know. This is something I was talking with somebody else about earlier today. Is just playing out the thought experiment. If you were able to get the technology so good, let's say you solve the haptics problem. Let's say OVR becomes a mainstay in the Oculus 20 or whatever it is, and you're able to simulate some of these experiences. Is reality still more desirable?
Man, that's that's a scary question. I interviewed Myron Kruger, who was early VR guy. Old people will recognize his name from the 80s. And I asked him this question, and he goes, I said, do you think people get addicted to VR? And he goes, no, it's not good enough. But when it does get good enough, then we're going to have to be careful. And, you think about what was the context in Ready Player One for why everybody spent so much time in these metaverse experiences. Well, it's because the world had turned to crap. The real world was just a dystopian nightmare of ecological, disaster and all that. Well, maybe we've got to start thinking about how we make our real world a little more safe and compelling. Otherwise, the real world might lose the challenge when VR becomes so real. Like how Ray Kurzweil talks about nanobots going into your bloodstream and attaching to synapses, and and where you don't even have a device. It's a neural input, and people talk about this all the time. But it's fortunately way out there. I don't know. I might be a sucker for that too. Or I might just say, hey, why do I have to drive 15 miles in LA traffic to go to the beach? I can just turn on the beach now in my brain.
Yeah. I think it's I think it's a real concern. I mean, I am firmly on team reality for sure. I think most people still are, but the DSM-5, I believe, has video game addiction as a new a new type of addiction, and that's right now constrained mostly to 2D interfaces. And so it is possible to already deliver virtual experiences that are so compelling that it gets in the way of basic health. So
that whole formulation in DSM has evolved over the years, but honestly, would you ever refer to a kid as having a gymnastics addiction or a violin addiction or a cooking addiction? Why don't we refer to those things as addictions if kids are, 4 hours a day at a gymnastics class because they want to be in the Olympics? Sure. Well, gaming, yes, I think that it's a bad thing for a child to spend 10 hours a day playing video games. That I think it's a bad thing for a child to spend 10 hours a day doing gymnastics, honestly. What's a passion, a pastime, or an addiction? Perhaps some element of video games actually train cognitive function, train reaction time. We need to look at what's going on and what does that video game replace. If you want to look at what it's replacing, just look at my generation where I sat on my butt watching TV, 3 or 4 hours a day, passive. I learned a lot about storytelling, because I'm watching stories all the time, whatever, and sometimes, dumb stories. But, is that what it's replacing? That might not be a bad thing to be replacing, to have active, engaged, interactive content. Keeping in mind that excess in any of these things is not good. You want to grow up in a well-rounded experience. So I understand parents' concerns, but I also don't want to over-pathologize this activity. And, now, you could say, well, gymnastics, you could have a career in that. Well, you can have a career in esports. I'm bringing this up for the sake of argument to provide balance. Yeah. I'm not advocating for kids to play video games all day. Maybe if some of the video games become part of their education and they're really designed with good pedagogy and good psychological well-being, immersive narratives for children, that whether it's part game, but there's a learning experience embedded in there to help kids become more empathetic, less bullying, look at both sides of an argument in order to get through a quest. These are ways that we might be able to make that time of more value.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's a range in that question of what is the point of this activity? What are you sort of getting out of it? In the case of the folks who are learning motivational interviewing or being able to practice, if you can create something that's compelling and engaging, where you're learning skills that you can apply to making, your local environment, your family life, whatever else, better, then, game mechanics can be a great thing. So,
and I think it's more relevant to the future work, the kinds of work people are going to be doing. That's a whole episode right there. What is being trained in games and how that relates to actual later life occupations.
Well, maybe we'll have to have you back on. Yeah. We'll do many topics we can dive into. One I did want to go into before we close out is you are an entrepreneur as well. So you co-founder of a startup called Virtual Psychedelics Inc. (VPI). Could you share a little bit about what you're up to?
Yeah. Well, I work with my old buddy Brett Leonard, who you may recognize the name. He was the director of the movie Lawnmower Man back in the early 90s. That kind of kicked off the first hype cycle in VR. And, it's not as wild and crazy as the name might sound. The research, it's interesting that the research in psychedelic therapy has evolved kind of in parallel with the research with virtual reality in clinical applications. And we're at a point now where there's something to be said about the potential for different variants of psychedelic therapy actually having an impact on PTSD, on depression, on substance use disorder. That when done in a very safe, managed, controlled setting, embedded within a context of good therapy sessions leading up to the event and after to reconsolidate the experience, there's a lot to be said on the psychedelic front for the value. And even for some of the active ingredients that are like with psilocybin, now they're extracting a thing called psilocin, which eliminates a lot of the trippy element of psilocybin, but actually does have that effect of creating that kind of inward thoughtful experience and that ability to navigate experiences maybe with less defensiveness and so on. So there's still a lot to do, but the science so far that had been restricted up until the 90s now is starting to show some real promise. And we need to do that science. Well, VR, it's not like you magically throw these two things together and you get, exponential value. It's not just throw it together and it's going to be better. It's the thoughtful use of VR to help in strategic junctures in this sort of psychedelic therapy, to use it on the front end before anybody ever has an experience, to do things that prepare people for what that experience might be when they have the psychedelic session. People in the field talk about set and setting. So preparing somebody, particularly somebody who's never had any experience with these types of drugs in the past, but then crafting the experience. For some people, some psychedelic therapy is like non-directive. You're going to have your inner experience. Your therapist is there as a guide, as a coach, as a safety mechanism. But sometimes people with different clinical conditions, it's not just about an existential understanding of their place in the world, but rather there's a target of an area that they want to address. And where it makes sense, VR can be introduced at strategic junctures. Nobody's going to wear a headset for 5 or 6 hours, but they're going to have access to crafted experiences that could have a lot of value. And then the added S to set and setting is what I call sustainment. And that is doing things during that experience that you can do again in VR later on without the drug, but that serves to promote generalization of what's learned in the psychedelic experience. Uh, so you're promoting generalization to the real world later on. So I think there's a lot of strategic junctures, a lot of research, of course, but it's not a harebrained scheme to think that judicious use of it, and whether it's a headset or a pod-like experience with projections is one of the areas we're funded to work on with VPI. I think it's a worthy area to explore. It's one that I personally, I'm not doing this one for the money. I'm doing it because I think it's a good one. It's very exciting and interesting. So I'm hopeful that expands. I'm involved, in other companies as well, cognitive training companies. I work with a company that's taken one of my old projects, the virtual classroom, for attention process assessment, particularly with ADHD. The company Cognitive Leap, partner in that. Basically, to put it in a nutshell, I've done all this scientific research and development since the mid '90s. And some of it has gotten out into the world, working with autism, some good apps and PTSD stuff. But my mission now at this point in my career, I think it should be, is to kick stuff out of the lab, take all that stuff we learned in the lab, all that prototypic development, and now work with groups that can actually put it in the hands of users. And that's the part of my career I'm embarking on now. I reduced my time at USC, a little more than half, but the rest of my time is getting stuff out the door and taking all that knowledge that sometimes folks that do startups, they don't have that knowledge base of all the research that's been done.
Yeah.
Now we can do that. So that's where
getting it out into reality.
Kick it out of the lab. Yeah, get into reality.
Get it out of the lab. Awesome. Well, on that point, I'm very much looking forward to learning more about the work you're doing to support folks in Ukraine. I know I don't think there's a website yet. Is that right?
Yeah. All this has happened in the last month, just putting the teams together.
Awesome. So as soon as when this episode goes live, I'm going to put the website, way to learn more and maybe get involved. I think a very, very compelling project you're working on there, and clearly you're the right person to be spearheading it. And on that note, in terms of folks getting in touch, what is the best way to get in touch with Professor Skip Rizzo?
Well, I hate to say old school email. I have a Facebook page that's more personal and political ranting, and my Twitter is at Skip Rizzo VR. But I'm old school. Send me an email, send you some stuff back, and plan a time to chat.
Sounds great. Well, I will put those links in the chat. So Twitter, email, and soon learn more about the Ukraine project. Skip, this was really a pleasure. Thanks for spending the time with me, and hopefully we can get you back on.
Pleasure for me, man. Good questions, and your work I'm impressed with. I think you're doing something really good, and I'm grateful that you had me on the podcast here.
Thank you. All right.